Good morning. I just want to thank our panelists here for being with us today. And what we're hoping to do in this session is really focus on the practical realities of operating in high-risk jurisdictions and what that means both from the compliance side, but also balancing with the business side. After all, everybody works for companies that are trying to make money and not necessarily just do the right thing. And so we'd like to get both the perspective from in-house practitioners as well as from Geert, where you see advising clients in these areas. But to start with, I'll ask the question, which is really basic question, but I think one that companies struggle with, which is what does it mean to operate in a high-risk jurisdiction? In the sense of if you look at the markets you're operating and you rely, for example, on Transparency International's model, every country you are in is likely to be a red zone. So what is high risk for your company, and what sort of assessment do you do on the front end to assess where your risks really lie?
Well, good morning, everyone. I think high risk is trying to set up an event in Rio at 9 in the morning. Anyway, good morning. I'm glad you all made it. So for control risks, where we advise basically on high-risk issues. High risk for us genuinely means big opportunity. For our clients, I think the common denominator for high-risk environments are, either or high, financial impact of a particular type of risk, business disruption, or significant, and I think the most importantly, significant reputational damage. And that's not just corruption. I mean, we'll discuss that a little bit further, but we can talk about major security type incidents that we've seen in different places throughout Latin America. We can talk about cyber risk, political intervention and the like. All of those are high risk events and quite characteristic of what's happening in Latin America. One thing I'd like to add about corruption and CPI specifically. Obviously CPI by definition is corruption perception. Perception is not always a good proxy for reality. I think if we take, over the past years, and most of you are familiar with that, you look at, Transparency International CPI index. Basically, Brazil's always been kind of medium risk. We have some neighboring countries which are high risk: Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. Mexico is higher risk. So if compliance efforts are guided by CPI, you would probably have disproportionate efforts in some of the other countries, less here. But from a risk management perspective, what's important for a company is how real or how probable is that risk, and what kind of impact may that risk have. When you're in a heightened enforcement environment like Brazil, or in China for that matter, the risk you're actually running with corruption at this point is higher, for example, in Brazil than in Mexico. That's not to say, and this is why I think it's important to distinguish between the two, that's not to say that corruption is worse here than Mexico. I would venture to say that if we really dug in Mexico, we might see worse things than we're seeing here in Brazil, without offense to anyone who is from Mexico. But I think it's important to distinguish between the two. So the reality of corruption and enforcement and the practices and the perception index.
Hello, good morning. I fully agree with what Gert said, and I have an interesting case. Just a brief introduction. You can read there, it's Daimler Latina. What does it mean? I work at Mercedes in Brazil, but for the region, Daimler also, the group also sells products from the US, Freightliner, Western Star trucks, and Fuso trucks produced in Japan, also in the whole region. As we have no sales for those brands in Brazil, so that is created a virtual company that is called Daimler Latina to handle the business for all brands in all countries. So that is interesting to talk about high risk. Once I had a training session with some distributors from Haiti, one of the worst perception index that we have in our region is 19. And I said, okay, the corruption index is this one, and Haiti ranked as 19. So the perception is high risk, and the guys, they start to be really, so it's really hard to say, are you blaming me? Are you saying that I'm corrupted just because I'm here? I said, no, we have to explain. what does it mean? The perception is different. So we really need to, fully agree with Gert said, we really need to take care about what we're talking about for our partners. In case of Daimler, for all 43 countries that we have in Latin America, the whole majority of them, we have independent distributors. So that means they represent the brand or the brands in their respective countries. So it's really difficult to select the partners and also to monitor them. And talking about risks, for Daimler, we use basically a tool that we call upfront risk assessment, URA, that we use also the CPI to start the analysis of this ranking, the business model, because as they represent the brand, they can nominate dealers, so they can promote wholesale and retail. We check out about the ownership structure. Of course, talking Latin America, we have many countries that they are located in tax haven countries, so we really need to take a closer look on that. Do not blame that about that, but we have to increase the risks for the operation. We need to check the compensation type, the sales volume that they intend to have in the region, if they engage third parties, and especially when you're talking about buses or trucks, most of the cases we are talking about sales to the government, so it's also related to increase the risks that we have for our partners. Okay.
Good morning to everybody. Well, since I am Argentina, I think that I am the highest risk person in this panel. And, well, so help me avoiding my own risks. And I heard someone that said once that the highest risk is not seeing the risk. And that's what I think in high-risk countries is the highest risk, the cultural risk of not knowing what you are doing because you're doing some things the same way in the last, I don't know, 100 years. So for me, working and identifying risks in high-risk environments is mainly working on the cultural phase of risks. The way people do not perceive they are behaving the wrong way because everybody does some kind of things and everybody has done that kind of things for the last years and nothing happens. I think that is the risk perspective and also the enforcement perspective together combined what makes our high-risk countries the way they are. Nothing is perceived as non-compliance, or many behaviors are not perceived as non-compliance, and on the other side, they are not enforced as non-compliance by the public authorities or the administrative authorities. So this is something. And the other thing is that I think that once you identified in your heat map which are your highest risks, you should work on the business models. Otherwise, identifying the high risks areas and not translating that identification into changes in the business models is I think, something that you should think about, because if you work in a high-risk environment, this should for sure have some consequences on the business models. You should, if you want to avoid that risks. If you want to do a formal, bureaucratic, and only for the tick-in-the-box risk model, okay. But if you want to really avoid or neutralize or at least identify and work for the future in trying to mitigate those risks, you should work with the business in changing business models. Maybe it's more difficult for global companies to change business model depending on the country, but I think that it's worth it to think about that.
Your last point brings a good question of changing the business model. Often what we hear from clients is that compliance is usually one day behind the business. And it's very hard for compliance to keep up with business. And there's a lot of pressure from the business side to, we understand compliance is important, but we really need to get this deal done. And so what do you find that can be done on the proactive side, from the compliance side, in order to support the business in a way that you're not always lagging behind them?
Well, it's really a challenging question because it is our day-to-day job. I mean, changing business models is not something that the companies can do from one day to the other. But I think compliance should be in the business process from the beginning, from the definition of the strategic business model, the costs, the engagement of third parties, all the design and structure of a business should be reviewed by us also in order to prevent those risks. Because if you know that you are starting a business model based on distributors and you're going to the public sector, public bids in Argentina, well, you know that you are facing and translating or giving the risk to the value channel, and you have to really select distributors very carefully. Otherwise, you should have an issue tomorrow. But if you are working on a business model that is already there, maybe you should start working on changing that business model and going directly to the public sector instead of going through distributors, in order to really have more control on the risks. It depends on the company, it depends on the market, so you should have a very, very deep approach to the market you are facing, and to the portfolio, and you should be a business person, not a compliance pure person.
A concept that we work a lot at Daimler is not regarding compliance. Compliance means tons of rules, written rules, guidelines, processes, everything. So something that we try to work with all employees that we call integrity. So even the department, we call the department's integrity now, not only compliance, because we start to try to put in the mind for all employees that each one has an internal compass that can say that's right and wrong. So that is a change of mindset, and then in any situation when they face something that, okay, it's weird business model, or I might have a red flag here, so they know what, based on this internal compass that we are working with them, it doesn't matter if it's written or not, a rule. But they have this, okay, a red flag, so compliance is close to the business, let's discuss, let's be transparent, and to find the best way to find a better solution. Because the easiest way for a compliance person is to say no. Can I do this, can I do that? No. So this is the easy answer. The challenge is, what can we do together to reach a yes for any kind of situation? This is the main challenge.
Yeah, just very quickly to round that out. So one of the things that I think many clients are seeing, there's a bit of overkill on all kinds of chief something officers in companies, as you're well aware. So I think the rebranding and refocusing of compliance, and I'm not quite even sure whether compliance is an appropriate term anymore. It's kind of gotten stale and old. No offense to anyone out here. It's very easy to change the title on your business card, so it's not a personal comment. But compliance is essentially risk management. And you know, if the objective of a company is to make profit, do that responsibly, and bring value to shareholders and stakeholders, then risk management is identifying and managing those risks which stand in the way of a company being able to achieve those objectives. Compliance is a subset of that. And I think it's very, very difficult for compliance teams and compliance officers, as long as they're separated out in silos, very much looking reactively from a regulatory point of view, seeing what the company needs to comply with, and like isolated from other enterprise risks. It's very, very difficult, I think, to get the type of influence in decision-making, so being at the front end of the business in those kind of circumstances. So I would be all pro an entire rebranding of the compliance area, but you know, as I said, this is just to provoke a little bit of a response, and if anyone feels revolted, please feel free to throw a shoe or something.
Only a thing, though.
Only him.
At me.
We're talking very high level about risk, but what is actual risk for the companies, and where do you spend the focus of your limited resources when we're talking about risk? Is it I think there's more of a global standardization against the fight against corruption, but there's certainly other risks involved. And so when you're talking about operating in a high-risk market, what risks are you really addressing or focused on?
Well, as I said before, I think that high-risk countries, Argentina is the best example, have additional risks that are not only in the heat map of the companies. I mean, political instability, economic crisis make people change the way they think about risks, and maybe they are much more influenced by the short-term objectives, and it is difficult for us to think in the long term. And we have also the challenge of thinking about decisions that are being made today at companies in any country, high risk or non-high risk, will be judged and will be analyzed maybe 5 to 10 years after, when some issue can arise, and they will be analyzed based on standards that we have to think which will be in 10 years or 5 years. And that is also a challenge, because when I'm not talking about my current company, my current employer, but when I work in another companies, what happened was that people think that the way the decisions will be judged and analyzed was taking into account what happened today in the world. And the world is changing, and the standards are changing, and things that we 5 or 10 years ago didn't even think could happen, like 2 judges sending each other information regarding bank accounts in Switzerland and opening bank accounts, and employees saying in loud voice what have they seen, and the FIFA case. I think that who didn't know what happened inside that organization? Nobody. But who could think that they will be ever in the front line of the papers? Nobody also. So it is challenging to think about what we decide today will be judged 5 to 10 years before that, after that, with another kind of set of standards, and we have to kind of analyze which the future standards will be. And for me, that is something difficult to say, to think.
So I think, now I'm going to be nice to you. So for all of you who are focusing on compliance or risk management, your roles are super, super important with respect to a whole range of risk issues. And the ones we're seeing right now, besides corruption, which is obviously a major risk issue for most companies, we're seeing a tremendous amount of focus on antitrust, particularly in Latin America. So Brazil, the Brazilian antitrust environment, I don't know how many of you here have dealt with antitrust issues in your organizations. I'm not asking whether you've participated in cartels, but simply that you've focused on antitrust issues as part of your compliance remit. So Brazilian antitrust enforcement is pretty much on par to the EU, United States, and Japan globally. Very, very sophisticated, very, very professional, and very, very problematic for companies. But we're seeing other places. Mexico is starting to pick up. Colombia is starting to pick up. Chile is starting to pick up on antitrust. So antitrust I would put up way up there. Second risk issue, and obviously that is not just a compliance issue, but compliance and risk management certainly are involved there. Cyber risk. This is an emerging issue here in Brazil and through other parts of Latin America. It is absolutely, any kind of survey in the US right now, it's amongst the top 3. I've lived and worked in Brazil for about 17 years, and we advise a lot of companies here. What's unique about Brazil, in a very problematic sense about cybersecurity, is Brazilians are hugely tech savvy and early adopters of technology. I mean, you're all amongst the top 3 users of Twitter, Facebook, all kinds of social sites. The second thing is that Brazil, I think, has a relatively, from a cyber security perspective, a relatively weak law enforcement environment, so that the technology is not there or the capacity is not there to combat and enforce and try and investigate cybercrime. And the third thing is Brazil is strategically important for most major multinationals. So there's a lot of sensitive and interesting information sitting out here for nation states or for cybercrimes or hacktivists, whoever it might be. And lastly, Brazil is extremely permissive, culturally speaking, and that's one of the wonderful things about working here, but it's also problematic for organizations, in terms of information security. There's a generally casual atmosphere around information security, what's confidential, what's not confidential. Like, this is a perfect storm for cybercrime, and I'm sure cyber risk is going to be very quickly one of the main risks in Brazil. And the third one I would add, and this seems like a really standard or banal type of compliance risk, labor and tax. In an environment, again, focusing on Brazil, where government is looking for tax revenue and government is looking for job stability, the traditional complexity of labor and tax compliance just becomes worse and exacerbated. So I'd say those 3 things we're seeing quite frequently.
If I may, I would also add money laundering.
Yeah.
Money laundering, I think, is another hot topic that I have in our region. And talking about risk assessment, we can, I think, split into 2 sides. One thing is the high-risk environment, and the other thing is high-risk partner. So we need to make sure that you have the right partner in order to mitigate the risks that you have in your environment. Once I was also in a country, high-risk country, that for us, that means CPI below 35, Argentina below 35, Argentina below, Colombia 36. Yeah.
But we will beat you in football.
Yes.
No, Colombia beat you in football.
Yes. So, but it's CPI 35 and below. I won one of those countries, and I start to talk about nice things, about antitrust, money laundering, compliance, rules, prevention of corruption. And one thing, when you start to talk about compliance rules and integrity and everything for the employees, for the company that you work, another thing is you're talking about a third party, especially when they need to put money and to invest in something, to create something in order to mitigate risks. And when I start to talk about a lot of things, we conduct everything with sales and compliance. We are always in the same boat. And the owner, he said, "Who do you think you are? The Pope?" Something, it's not the case to be the Pope. So I'll try to change the world. That means
Argentine
really,
people can also change. That means Argentine people can also change. The Pope is Argentine, by the way.
Yes, and a good one.
And a good guy.
And a good one. But the point is, it's hard even for the people that they are living in a high-risk environment to accept something related to try to mitigate risks. I think it's part, they grow up with all this corruption involved, and it's hard when you start to think about to be clean, it's difficult. Something that I can say, even for many multinationals, the multinationals start with this wave of compliance, and then everything was rolled out in the headquarters in many different countries, and then they start with this wave for the subsidiaries, for example, for Mercedes in Brazil, or for Mercedes in Argentina, or in Colombia. And now as everything was done, and then another wave. We are trying to, not just to convince, but also to introduce a lot of this integrity concept for our third parties. So this is important to select it really carefully, your third parties. So there's a kind of a wave that started, I can say, the first world, the United States, Japan, and in Germany, or Europe in general, and then roll out to subsidiaries around worldwide, and now I think this third step for third parties.
One theme that I hear across all your answers is the idea of balancing a high risk versus enforcement of what's the likelihood that something is actually going to be enforced, and how you educate or train the people within your organizations to understand that while something may be high risk, but low risk in terms of enforcement, it still needs to be a priority from the compliance perspective. And I'd be curious to hear from you what your companies are doing or what your clients are doing in order to instill that it's important to comply even if the enforcement doesn't necessarily reflect the reality.
Well, that is our main challenge, because what I always talk with the business people is that we are not anymore working in an environment in which decisions are made in one place and have effects only in that place. And no matter what you do in the company, it could affect the whole, the global structure of the company, and rules that apply are not even local rules, and we have kind of a sub-legal system living together with the legal system of the countries. We have different systems that are legally interactive, and we have to take into account all of them. And something that is really difficult to explain, but once they understand it, they get it, is that maybe nothing will happen in Argentina, for example, in a criminal case, because Argentina's enforcement is very low. But once something is being investigated in another jurisdiction, it can have a really critical consequences to even the local investigation. So that, and I put examples, I have a lot of examples in which another country is investigating something, and then that information comes into the local investigation and really makes the news at the next day, so they can identify this as a real situation. So we are not only doing business in a global environment, but also sharing information in a global environment, and also making decisions that have consequences in a global environment from the compliance perspective. So that is how we face with this, showing real cases.
Just came in my mind that years ago, have a legislation in Brazil that, okay, you have to fasten your seatbelt. If not, you can get a fine. And before that, nobody cares about security, about anything. So when it starts to hurt their pocket and the population start, okay, I need to fasten my seatbelt. The same happened, I think, in a business environment. Of course, especially for Daimler, we are talking about distributors that we have all countries that they represent the brand. And so they are really powerful. Especially we are talking about sales of trucks, buses, and luxury cars. And it's not common, I can say, to terminate a contract. But in some circumstances, when you have really compliance problems that was identified through audits, regular audits that we have in our region, and critical things were identified, and there was a decision. Okay, we have to terminate the contract. It doesn't matter what we can do. We have to create a task force for after sales, everything, because we have customers there, blah, 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 but we cannot survive in this environment with this partner as he did a lot of things against our values, let's put it this way. So, in the same way that I said the example for the seatbelt, that way I said, okay, that hurts the dealer net that we have in our region for all countries. But for sure, the same day, all of them, they were aware about what happened. They talk a lot, for sure. And after that, I can say that not that it was easier to talk about compliance in the region, but they need to see that how serious is this compliance topic for the company. This is something that somehow we have to show to them or demonstrate.
So I'm just going to backtrack a little bit from take one step back from the question. I think the idea behind low probability high, or excuse me, it could be low probability high impact risks or whatever it is that's sitting on the the left-hand side of the risk matrix, whether at the bottom or the top there. I think that the most important thing, and I think this is where many companies already start off on the wrong foot, is the quality of the risk assessment. If the idea there is to identify risks which are relevant for the company, and I think that's where that needs to be the starting point, and then we realistically assume that the company is, has got obviously there's a compliance angle, there's an ethics angle, but there's also simply a business angle there, which is cost benefit, and is this something worth trying to mitigate, because it could be cost prohibitive to try and do so. One of the things about, I think, corruption, risk assessments in general, is companies, when they go and identify what the key risks are for their company, and many of you might be able to identify this, are very often exclusively reliant on internal assessments, interviews, workshops, whatever it might be, and you're looking at a subset of risks which are known within the company, or generally, people read in the paper or hear from their colleagues or whatever. Very few companies actually proactively reach outside the company to see what kind of risks there might be. Key risks to your key suppliers, key risks to your key clients. Look at industry groups, look at insurance companies, what kind of risks have they identified, external experts. And I'm mentioning this because sometimes I think some of the risks which we're looking at are not necessarily the most relevant risks, and sometimes we're not even looking at relevant risks altogether. So the risk assessment then creates kind of false sense of comfort, and it's probably worse than not having a risk assessment at all. The other thing I think is really important, particularly just getting back to the high-risk environment point of view, is there's a real necessity in high-risk environments to constantly refresh these risk assessments, because the risk dynamics here are very, very different than the Alps in Switzerland. Save avalanche risks or whatever if you're into skiing. I think the importance of constantly refreshing the risk assessment and making sure, and that's I think a key role for compliance and risk areas, to promote that kind of discipline within the organization is extremely high. So I didn't want to sidestep the question, but I think it does beg the question: what are the key risks for the companies, and what should actually be addressed, and what should be prioritized?
And I'd like to take a pause here now and see if there's any questions in the audience before we go back, I think, to your concept about rebranding compliance.
I wonder if there are cases where your organization decided not to do business at all due to high-risk compliance in certain countries, or alternatively, you always find solutions.
I can say in Latin America, we have a really high-risk environments, according to our concept based also in the CPI. We have Venezuela, Haiti, Ecuador, Paraguay, Nicaragua, Honduras, Bolivia, Paraguay, so many countries. But even though we have customers there, so the first point is to really have a robust selection process. We have to monitor them. And somehow, you can also have some contractual restrictions in order to mitigate the risks, and always they need to be aware that they are monitored all the time. So, but I think the key is to really try to find the best partner that you can work, because we're not talking about 30 parties. the key is not only to have a good due diligence, but also to have a good partner. So somebody that you can trust. At the beginning, I said this situation in Haiti. The guys there said, okay, are you blaming me because I'm here, or are you saying that I'm corrupted because I'm here? In Haiti, they have a really poor situation there, but you cannot blame there. And also, you have customers there, so you need to attend the customers somehow. So the point is, what can you do to mitigate the risks?
I'd say maybe 40% of our business is actually conducting very deep investigations into potential business partners, into country entry and the like. And obviously I can't share details of clients and the like, but I would say 90% of the cases, I'm talking throughout Latin America, and I guess it's the same worldwide, 90% of the cases, companies are somehow comfortable that they can either mitigate the risk some way or other. There are probably 5 to 10% of the cases where companies are just genuinely uncomfortable about the political risk environment or the security environment or the corruption environment to have them take a decision not to move there. That obviously depends on the risk appetite of companies. That's a huge factor. You look at a company that's already been slammed by an FCPA suit versus perhaps a company from an emerging market that's got quite a heavy risk appetite or might not even be aware of all the risks. Depends very much on company, but I would say around there, and we have a pretty, I think, relevant sample of companies and due diligence to be able to give you those numbers. So very rarely is a country hands off altogether to operate in, and obviously it depends on the sector as well.
Although I will add, we have advised a number of clients of exiting markets. So the decision was made to enter the market, and they felt comfortable enough to do it. But as the operation actually continued, and some of the risks changed, there are a number of companies exiting certain markets. An example that has always struck me is the United States enforcement of the BSA and anti-money laundering rules. We're working with a number of foreign banks, for example, right now, who are looking to exit the U.S. market. It's just too cost prohibitive to have the type of compliance in place for those operations.
Sorry, just to add another comment. As I said at the beginning, we have to promote sales of products from the US, from Germany, and from Japan, in the whole region. So it's interesting not only to see how we can promote, for example, business in Latin America, but also how have to treat with different countries, different cultures. Okay, we are talking about first world, but they are completely different. In the United States, I can say that I have constant contact with them. It's like, just do it, and we will see. So it's a kind of trust. In Germany, you can say, okay, what is the process behind? So a lot of rules for everything. And in Japan, is another environment completely different. Usually, when you send something, they said, okay, could you reconfirm? That is common. I think it's part of the culture. And when we start to talk with them, for example, to promote sales in Venezuela or in Bolivia, it's hard for them to understand the upside down of the markets in the region. Even here in Brazil or in other countries, it's like a roller coaster. It's hard to try to increase sales in this kind of environment. Once we are discussing about sales of a lot of buses to a specific country in Latin America, with a specific department, and we are analyzing, checking with sales, the business model, the financial side, compliance side, how to mitigate the risks, and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly we receive, okay, it was decided by the president of that specific country to shut the department down. In less than 1 week, everything that we analyzed, we had to throw out because it's really difficult.
Hi, my name is Rogéria Jeremec. I'm Global Advisor of the Compliance Program for Serasa Experian. And I'd like to know if we have concrete tips for compliance professionals in order to conciliate the crisis we are facing right now, the necessity of the controls because of the crisis time, with the environment? How can we manage things in order to help our business partner to get the results they should achieve with the crisis and with the necessity of high controls? Gert is a free consultant for you. And for the others, a benchmarking. Thank you.
I guess that was directed at me. So I guess start off frankly that's a pretty challenging task I think all of you have right now to balance what are even more limited resources than normal, particularly here in Brazil, because obviously with the economy the way it is, companies are in no mood to spend money. And on the other hand, I think a heightened perception of risk, almost to the point of paralysis. And I think what we saw in the beginning of this year, and I think many of your companies saw that, the first 2 or 3 months this year here in Brazil were, they're usually unusual anyway, because it's usually unusual, because, pre-carnival and things like this, but they were incredibly slow because I think there was just a sense of what is happening. No one really understood what was happening in Brazil. And I think people don't deal tremendously well with uncertainty. I think right now, no one is particularly optimistic, but I think things are a little bit clearer about how things might ultimately pan out, that this will still take a long time, that Brazil's probably not going to plummet into the abyss, but that things, recovery will take some time to come back. So the one thing, I'm getting back to a point which I made before, Rogéria, is I really genuinely believe that a very sober and calculated and objective risk assessment is the critical part of the engagement. I'm mentioning this because businesses do have to place priorities. Compliance areas do have to place priorities. Risk management areas do have to place priorities. And I know it's a delicate issue, and I'm not suggesting to be permissive about ethics breaches and the like. I don't think that's I don't think any organization wants to go there. But the reality is that you need to focus on, when you look at risk management, you have 4 options. You either look at the risk, you've identified it, you've seen it as an issue, and you decide what you had suggested, or companies may do. This is too much for us. This transaction is too much for us. It's beyond our risk tolerance. We're not going to participate in this bid. We're not going to invest country. So we're going to terminate that risk. Or you take the risk and you say, you know what? We see that risk. We think we're capable of absorbing the risk, even if it materializes. And I think that's also an option. Many companies get paranoid about, managing every single risk and spending resources, but sometimes it's better just to assume the risk and assume the, low probability, and the company may have, some issue going forward, but it's not going to sink the company. So you take the risk. That's the other option. The third one is to transfer the risk. And some companies that may have traditionally wanted to take the risk or able to take the risk on board may not have that appetite anymore, may not be financially sound anymore, and they may need to find some way to transfer that risk to third parties, via contracts, whatever it might be. I know some companies try to do this via corruption with third parties, so they transfer the corruption risk to third parties and have someone pay for them. That's not the kind of transfer I'm talking about, but transferring risk and sharing the risk with a business partner, a stronger business partner, is certainly an option. And the fourth one, obviously, is what we're all talking about here, is treating the risk. So looking at what needs to be done to actually manage that risk in a responsible manner. And again, not all risks can be treated to zero, which brings the other element, and I think this is where companies are even worse prepared, not just in Brazil, everywhere, but I think particularly across Latin America, is when you assume a certain level of risk, and most of you are familiar with the risk matrix, you have probability and impact. So most of what we're talking about here is trying to mitigate the probability somehow. When you assume a certain risk, a certain level of risk, you're also assuming the possibility that that risk will materialize. If you're assuming that as a responsible human being, as a responsible corporate officer, you need to make sure your organization is prepared to deal with the risk if and when it materializes. And that's crisis management, that's business continuity planning and the like. And sometimes, quite frankly, It's better to take on the risk because it's too costly to try and mitigate it, but make sure your organization is well prepared to respond if that risk materializes. So that's what I would state here, and happy to hear any other thoughts or questions.
Fabio, I would like to know if when, in the case that you mentioned, when you have to terminate the distributor in one country and the others got to know quickly about it, if these help the others maybe to change their behavior and increase their perspective of getting more compliance or getting more controls, if you could realize this.
Yes, for sure. And as I said before, we are used to, not us, but we check and monitor the results of audits that we have in all distributors that are having our region. So in that case, after that specific audit that was decided to terminate the contract, we continued with visits, face-to-face trainings to understand the markets, and then I can say that it was much easier to not much easier, but yeah, to implement something in their specific partners. We have something that we call compliance management system. That is 6 steps that we asked for our partners to implement in order to mitigate the risks. We are talking about the risk assessment that Gerd just said, to appoint a compliance person, not necessarily a full-time, but to have somebody responsible for compliance, to have a good selection process, to have an employee screening, to have policies, procedures, and training, and to have also a whistleblowing system. And so everything we asked for our partners to have, and also we asked for them to contract a Big Four audit firm to certify that everything was implemented. So doing that, we can say that we can increase the level of trust that we have with our partners, because it's important for them and important for the company to play in the same, to be in the same page and to play the same, let's say, the same process that we have in our region. Something also that we need to understand, especially in our markets in Latin America, just two curious questions. Brazil is facing a really bad situation, financial situation. I can say for the truck market, for Mercedes, dropped almost 40%. But the other hand, for luxury passenger cars, Mercedes increased 30%. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's where all the money's going.
Yeah, nobody can understand. So Brazil is crazy. But also, to understand what happened in the other countries, you need to be there, we need to talk with them, and you need to be transparent and flexible. For example, we have in Ecuador, we have partners there to distribute products, and Ecuador is also facing a really difficult situation, and they decided, the government there decided to increase import sales in almost 50% for almost all kinds of products that you can imagine. Shampoo, cars, whatever, food. So, and of course, what happened with the sales? Almost zero for everything. So, and then we can ask for our partner, okay, you need to implement this to spend money. They said, no, I'm facing a really hard situation now. Everything increased almost 50% in import tax. So you need to be flexible, you need to be transparent, and to try to reach a really better solution for both sides. So this is a challenge.
I have one question actually coming out of your answer there about the idea of needing to be flexible and recognizing that countries are different, cultures are different, risks are different. Do you think there can be such thing as a global compliance program?
I think yes. I think that is almost the most important thing in a compliance program, that standards are applied the same way in each and every country. Otherwise, it's all being challenged and discussed by the business and say, no, we do things otherwise here. And there comes a lot of problem from that kind of of discussion. I think that our values should be lived and in our system in each and every country the same way, and the compliance program seems to be only the external way of showing how our values are applied in the business. What I also think is that from a cultural perspective, we have to be sometimes very, very strict in terms of principles, but a little bit more flexible in terms of procedures because of our culture. So if something, to give an example, if something is really compliant and is something we can do, I am not more focused on giving me the paper today. You can give it to me tomorrow. I mean, it's not something I will die for or I will fight to death with the business, or I will say, don't do it because you don't have the form already filled. But if you cannot do it because it's risky for the company or it's against our rules, you cannot do it no matter if you give me 10 papers that show that the formal requirements are already met. So I think globally we have the same things. Locally, maybe we can have some kind of flexibility because our culture is living for tomorrow, everything. So every paper will be on your desk tomorrow, usually.
I think probably the same response, but I think so. The global contours and the building blocks, the Lego blocks of the compliance program will probably be similar everywhere. I think the two things which are going to be very distinct are, one, going to be driven, again, by the risk assessment, which is very unique to the country, so focus points, how to address those particular types of risks. The second part, and again, addressing Claudia's point to culture, is that's going to vary from place to place. How much carrot, how much stick you have in your program. For example, how you draft your program and how you conduct training. If you look at an ethics code here in Brazil, it tends to be quite detailed because people kind of want to know what's permitted, what's not permitted. Maybe a little bit less principle-based than a short 2-page, ethics code, which might not go down very well here in Brazil. So those types of things, which I think are cultural. So yes and no, if that's a helpful answer.
I know we have time for one more question. Thank you. Hello. I'd just like to understand better, going back to the third parties. When you said, Fabio, for example, the 6 steps to the compliance, to go to your distributor and say, look, you have these 6 steps. It seems to me that it's something when you are starting business with this third party, probably, so you have a minimum compliance program that they should have. But my question would go, when you are watching things on TV here in Brazil, for example, and seeing things going on, and so nobody is killed yet, but you are seeing many third parties with their names in some places, and so you are not feeling comfortable when you see one of your third parties there. So in this situation, what kind of request do you do at your companies? Do you ask them to provide some information? Because it's different when it's proven that they did something wrong, but when it's not, how do you deal at this moment?
Yes, I can use an example about this car wash. We have mainly the construction companies, and we have the brokers and banks that are involved. So something that we did in our company, of course, construction companies, they buy trucks. And as end customers. And also, the plant, we contracted them as a service provider. The same way for the brokers. We have contract with them. So something that we did, we have a SAP platform that we call mandatory consultation process. So all sales, all direct sales, not through the dealers, but everything that we have in a special condition or a special price or a direct invoice from the plant to those construction companies involved in this car wash operation, as we cannot say that they are guilty. and we monitor all of them. So through this mandatory consultation process, there is a kind of approval that needs to be done by legal, compliance, sales, and financial controlling. That way we can monitor all the sales that we are running through those customers. And the same way, for the brokers, for example, we checked all the contracts, we renew all of them. For the ones that were really old, we updated with some amendments regarding compliance clauses for all the contracts, anti-bribery clauses or audit rights or whatever that is needed in order to protect the company. Okay.
I would also add that it depends on the issue also. You should monitor if the issue is a past one, because rules have changed. And I mean, every company have, in a way, changed the way they behave in the last 12 or 20 years. So if it is a past issue and my third party has already changed and applied the same standards, is one thing. And if it is a new issue, I would probably take another decision, that maybe termination or maybe... And the other thing is that in this cultural environments also, reputational issues sometimes depend on political issues or on other interests that are not related to really non-compliant behavior, but with other things. So you should be very careful regarding the information. You should look inside the issue in order to really know if there is something that is involving your third party, or they are using your third party to maybe some other, to respond to some other. Not all of the things that are printed in the papers are truth. And sometimes they are part of the truth or nothing with respect to the truth. So I would go with a professional view of the third party's reputation, and ask our lawyers or our financial people to know if this makes sense or has been made up.
And I recognize that we're out of time, and I certainly don't want to mess the schedule up for the rest of the day. So I just want to thank our panelists and thanks the audience for the great questions.